Hi, I'm Lisette, and this is Book Date. I am going to call these segments first chapters. I have gotten permission from Sebastian Nothwell to read the first chapter of his book, Fiorenzo. Um, there's a bit of a content warning on this one. It does portray images of a man pleasuring himself um, for the enjoyment of another man. If that bothers you, then by all means, stop now. But uh, to me, the most decadent thing about this is actually the language and the words that Sebastian uses. So, um, why don't we go ahead and get started? Chapter 1. Crowds flooded the streets and canals surrounding the dry docked ship. This, despite the icy winter wind that threatened to spill snow into the lagoons surrounding the city. The paper lanterns strung from windowsill to windowsill across every street, canal, and alleyway defied the evening's darkness. Likewise, the music of fiddles, lutes, pipes, tambourines, and raucous human voices defied any gloom. It was the final night of Saturnalia, and the people of Halcyon intended to make the most of it. Fiore among them. Fiore, a young man of 20 summers, leaned against the railing on the upper deck of the Kingfisher, which he called his home. The ship had run aground about a century earlier. Captain Corelli, lacking the funds to make it seaworthy again, had left it ashore and turned it into a tavern. She had willed it to her daughter, also called Corelli, who in turn willed it to her daughter, the third Corelli, who generously let a chamber below decks to Fiore by the week for his lodging and trade alike. Tonight, Fiore wore a mask. Most holy days in the city required at least a token mask, but his was a mere black paper domino that covered a slender 2 inches or so around his eyes and little else. To cover anything more wouldn't serve his purpose. His clothes didn't cover much either. And his breeches and hose, of course. Above the waist, however, he'd untied his shirt collar laces so that the deep plunging neck opened to expose the dark hair over his bronzed chest. He didn't have the brawn of some fellows, but his small and slender frame still had a particular appeal to a certain sort of gentleman whom he hoped to attract tonight. The scarlet sash around his waist removed any doubts about his trade. Despite the lack of cloak, the winter wind hardly seemed to touch him. The sheer crush of bodies drinking, dancing, and flirting on the deck created a bonfire's worth of warmth. Fiore had counted himself amongst their numbers for most of the evening. However, most of the gentlemen on deck seemed more inclined towards his feminine cohorts, and so he'd made his way to the railing for a breath of fresh air. The view below proved just as exuberant as the celebration aboard the dry dock ship. Boats crowded the canal like a pod of playful porpoises, hardly able to slide past each other, each carrying as many masked revelers as it could hold. The narrow fondamenta surrounding the ship itself likewise teemed with a multitude of costumes in a full prism's worth of color. The clear night sky, the fullness of the moon, the festive lanterns, and the ever-lit ediculi on each bridge and corner combined to set the whole city aglow, and it afforded Fiore a marvelous view, except for one particular sliver which remained in perpetual shadow. Shadows flitted all through the crowd, for one could hardly have light without casting shade, but this singular shadow remained rooted to one spot. At first Fiore didn't realize why his gaze kept returning over and over again to this anomaly. When his mind caught up to his eyes, however, he leaned out and squinted down for a better look at the queer phenomenon, and realized it was not a shadow at all, but a human figure. They stood well above the crowd swirling past them. They wore the costume of the Bauta, tricorn hat, waistcoat, breeches, and hose, the Tabaro cloak, and the Zendale hood, and finally the Bauta mask itself, with its distinctive prominent beak obscuring everything from nose to throat. Unlike the traditional Bauta, however, this particular shadow had everything in black, including the mask itself. From this distance, Fiore couldn't pick out the eyes in the black mask. Nevertheless, he met the mysterious gaze, and when he felt certain he had the Bauta's attention, granted them a winning smile and a resplendent bow, arising to toss his hand carelessly over his head as he invoked Io Saturnalia. Several anonymous voices returned the cheer from the crowds below, both below and above. The Bauta did not. They continued staring up at Fiore in silence for another moment. Then they dropped their gaze and headed toward the ship's starboard gangplank. Fiore watched their progress in eagerness. He hadn't really expected his proposition to work from such a distance and toward so mysterious a figure. Whoever they were, they moved with astonishing grace for someone of their stature. Not too drunk yet, if at all, which boded well for Fiore's purpose. He wearied of gentlemen who drank themselves out of performance and then blamed him for their inability to raise their masts. Soon the Bauta had surmounted the ladder and plunged into the crowded deck, whereafter Fiore beheld a particular tricorn hat bobbing well above the rest. The tide of bodies parted as the hat sailed forth, revealing in short order the full costume standing before Fiore, or rather looming over him, for the figure stood at least a head taller on a long, lean, lithe frame. With scarcely an arm's length between them, Fiore had a better look at their garb. He beheld the same hat, cloak, hood, and mask as before, but now they'd drawn near enough for him to realize the exquisite make and quality of these articles. The mask not of paper, but of gleaming leather, the silken hood trimmed in black lace, the cloak's wool of so fine a weave it seemed almost as shining smooth as the satin lining it. It matched the silver-buttoned waistcoat in black satin rather than wool. Modest sprigs of lace at the cuffs and throat of the white linen shirt beneath provided the only spots of light in an otherwise black costume. Black silk stockings clung to well-turned calves, and the satin breeches belied supple thighs. All of this Fiore glimpsed as the figure swept their coat aside to grant him a bow. Their commanding presence and the evident expense of their costume bespoke an aristocrat, yet, Fiore noted, not one too proud to grant courtesy to a courtesan. "Good evening," a deep voice rumbled up from the mask's depths. "Good evening," Fiore replied in kind, and then, because it was only polite to inquire, added, "My lord?" The Bauta, evidently a gentleman, gave a slow and solemn nod. "I've a room below decks if you have coin." Fiore found it best to state his intentions at the outset to prevent any misunderstanding, red sash or no. The gentleman appeared in no way off-put by this revelation, though admittedly Fiore could perceive little beneath the cloak, hood, and mask. "Lead on." Fiore smiled and offered the gentleman his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, whether reluctant, shy, or simply astonished at a courtesan's audacity, Fiore couldn't say. The Bauta accepted, winding his arm through the crook of Fiore's. His touch, even though both their sleeves, surprised and delighted Fiore with its warmth. The crowd parted before the pair of them, as it had done for the Bauta alone. Fiore led the way across the deck, through the dancers and drinkers, past the bar built into the forecastle, to the hatch behind it, and, with a nod to Corelli so she knew he was going below, and with whom, down into the belly of the ship. The captain's daughter had gutted the ship's hold when it became not just a tavern, but an inn and brothel. A dry dock ship, after all, required far less cargo space. Just enough to store a few dozen wine casks would suffice. As opposed to the hundreds of barrels of hardtack, salt cod, and fresh water a crew of sailors would need on a years-long voyage, plus whatever goods they intended to transport to and from Halcyon. Thus the floors of the living quarters had dropped down several feet, and more rooms put in below them. This meant Fiore could walk quite comfortably below decks. Even one so tall as the Bauta need only duck beneath beams rather than crouch all the way through. Likewise, unlike the sailors of old, Fiore had an entire cabin to himself, rather than sharing a berth with 20 other sailors all crammed in head to foot and stacked 3 high. Fiore took more than a little pride in his cabin. The scarlet curtains in the porthole window, as broad in diameter as the span of Fiore's arms, and well below the waterline, as if there remained any hopes that the Kingfisher would ever return to sea, precisely matched his own scarlet sash. Deck prisms, set into the ceiling, original to the ship, gave ample light by day. By night he had hanging lanterns, scavenged from scuttled gondola, their angle softened by curling brass laurel leaves. His own sketches adorned the walls, peculiar corners of Halcyon, beneath bridges and behind staircases, alongside figures and portraits of strangers and bedfellows. The cabin's most prominent feature was the bed, for reasons beyond even Fiore's profession. He cobbled it together out of the remnants of a whaleboat snapped in half by Leviathan's jaws and deemed beyond repair, fit only for scrap. While he couldn't make it seaworthy again, he could remove what remained of its keel and all the planks of its hull below the waterline, and use them to fill in the jagged gaps until he had what seemed like the prow of a whaleboat sailing through the floorboards and out of his wall into the center of his room. A dozen or so crossbeams sufficed to support the mattress he'd sewn into its peculiar shape. Fiore could glean little of what the Bauta thought of his chamber at first glance, but even beneath the mask and cloak, something in the gentleman's stance as he strode in at Fiore's invitation, how he turned his head to look about at all its features, and the way he laid a reverent hand on the bed's gunwales and slid his fingers up along its prow, made Fiore think he was at least somewhat impressed. "Now," Fiore said, shutting the door behind him with a soft thud, "how would you like me?" They couldn't kiss if the gentleman wished to keep his mask, but he might have Fiore on his knees before him or bent over to take him from behind. Some gentlemen, more than most folks might expect, and much more in line with Fiore's own preferences, wish to have Fiore inside them, and perhaps this gentleman would prove of that sort. The gentleman hesitated. "I'm afraid you may find it strange." Fiore doubted he would. He'd had a whole sea chest of treasures ready for gentlemen who wanted him to bind, gag, switch, or flog them. To the particular gentleman standing before him tonight, he said, "Try me." Again, the gentleman hesitated. "I would like to watch you." Fiore raised his brows. "Watch me as I pleasure yourself." Easily enough done, and as Fiore had predicted, far less strange than the gentleman proposed. He smiled. "As you wish." A hard swallow traveled down the gentleman's slender throat. If Fiore had read the gentleman correctly, he seemed the sort who enjoyed a bit of a tease. To that end, Fiore withdrew out of arm's reach and set his fingers to work unwinding the scarlet sash from around his waist. Some fellows like to keep the sash as a token. Fiore charged more for that, about double the cost of its replacement. Tonight he folded it over his arms, letting the scarlet fabric flow smoothly over the back of his hands, before laying it aside across the bow of his bed for the gentleman to peruse as he wished. The gentleman spared the sash a lingering glance, then his dark gaze flicked back to meet Fiore's own. Fiore bit back a knowing smirk. His fingertips fell to the buttons fastening the knees of his breeches. Then they arose to address the fall front. This was the part that seemed to draw the interest of most fellows, and the Bauta proved no exception. Fewer buttons than the waistcoat, though Fiore found a way to draw them out almost as long. The breeches joined the sash on the bed. Their loss offered a mere glimpse of his prize before the hem of his shirt fell into place like a demure linen curtain. Fiore bent to unfasten the garters of his hose in a manner with which he knew elongated his whole frame. Some gentlemen liked to claim these as souvenirs as well, and again Fiore felt willing enough to let them for a price. The Bouta made no mention of it, though if his hungry gaze were anything to go by, he felt sorely tempted. And if Fiore's fingertips did rather more caressing of his own calves than the necessity demanded, the gentleman didn't seem to mind in the least. Garters and hose tossed together on the bed, and at long last he drew his shirt over his head, hiding the gentleman from his view for a mere instant. When he threw the shirt aside and met the Bauta's gaze again, the sheer intensity of the longing in the stare behind the mask seemed ready to devour him. A grin stole over Fiore's face. He had the gentleman in the palm of his hand without laying a single finger on him. Still smiling, Fiore performed a quick turn for the gentleman, not half so elegant as a ballerino before the opera, perhaps, but graceful none the less, and offering what he'd been told was a magnificent view, though he had no looking-glass of his own. Many of the fellows who hired him had declaimed the beauty of his behind. Several, for Fiore worked with many artists, some as a courtesan, still more as a paid model, had rendered it in pencil, ink, paint, or sculpture. He wasn't vain enough to ask to keep any of the resulting artworks, but he did appreciate the opportunity to see himself from another angle. "Does this meet your approval, signore?" Fiore asked, tossing a coy glance over his shoulder. While Fiore couldn't see anything of the gentleman's face beyond the dark and compelling eyes, he saw plain how the whole shadowed frame had gone rigid, and it was with a certain hoarse quality that the gentleman replied, "Indeed," which Fiore found rather more inspiring than he'd anticipated. And so, without further ado, he crept onto his bed and knelt atop the counterpane to face the gentleman at the prow. Fiore smoothed his palms over the tops of his thighs as he settled into his performing posture. There was something about the Bauta's evident desire for him that provoked an answering desire within him. Perhaps a touch of narcissism on his part, but so be it. Either way, it meant that as he trailed his own fingertips down the center of his own bare chest and over his navel through the soft nest of hair surrounding his cock, he was already at half-mast. The gentleman's hand clenched on the prow. The long and elegant fingers within his black glove attracted Fiore's notice, and he imagined how their silken grasp would feel around his prick, another time perhaps. For tonight he had only his own hands. A few slow strokes sufficed to bring him to a full stand beneath the Bauta's compelling gaze. Fiore wondered if the gentleman would remark on his scars. The worst of them remained hidden by the nest of dark hair surrounding his stone purse. The one which sliced up the left side of the mask to split his foreskin, however, refused to be hidden. The gentleman's gaze lingered on the scar, or perhaps he merely appreciated Fiore's proud stand. Nevertheless, he said nothing of either, just clenched and unclenched his hands against the boat prow. Though Fiore noted a hitch in the gentleman's breath as he gave his cock a swift jerk. Remarkable restraint, particularly when contrasted against Fiore's own wanton display. For Fiore knew what he liked, and better still, he knew how to perform. Fiore bit his lip as he smeared the first few drops of seed across the head of his prick with the pad of his thumb. His stomach rippled as he thrust his hips up to meet his own fist. He let his throat unleash the moans the gentleman reined in. His free hand roamed wildly, smoothing over the tops of his trembling thighs, and flying up to feel the pulse fluttering in his collar. And throughout all this, Fiore looked up to meet the Bauta's masked gaze, then back down at himself, his lashes fluttering with each glance. The gentleman said nothing, nor moved, save the clench of those strong hands against the wood. But his breathing grew ragged, musical to Fiore's ears, and each catch in his throat made Fiore's cock twitch. Something about the gentleman's seething desire paired with his impeccable restraint, the thought of the lustful tides surging just beneath the flood wall of his mask, stirred Fiore's imagination. His fist moved faster and faster of his own accord. He envisioned that it might be what it might be like to lift the mask from the face and kiss whatever lips lay beneath, to slip his hands beneath the Tabaro cloak and delve into the silken breeches to grasp what surely by now must be an iron rod to rival his own, to cross their blades until sparks flew behind both their eyes, to bend the gentleman's great height over the boat's prow and fuck him into oblivion. And then his cock pulsed in his fist, and torrents of seed spilled over his knuckles as waves of pleasure racked his body. Instinct bid him curl in on himself, all muscles tautly convulsed, but that would block the splendid view the gentleman had paid for. So instead, he fell back against his mattress and let the last burst of his seed spray across his own chest. The gloved hands clenched again, but this time the whole frame stiffened, and a choked gasp echoed from beneath the mask. Unless Fiore very much mistook the matter, it seemed the gentleman had spent likewise, and all without a single touch. Satisfaction with both his own pleasure and with the job well done sent a slow smile creeping over Fiore's lips. He raised his seed-spattered hand to his mouth to lick it clean. The gentleman's eyes widened behind the mask's shadows. Fiore swept up the seed from his heaving chest with his thumb and sucked it off for good measure. A slow sigh escaped the gentleman. "Was that to your liking, signore?" Fiore murmured, breathless. In a haggard and harrowed voice, the gentleman replied, "Quite." Fiore grinned. The gentleman released his drowning hold on the bowsprit. At last, a steady breath trembled through his long frame. Then he bowed and strode from the chamber, pausing just long enough to set down a few coins on Fiore's nightstand. The door thudded shut behind him. Fiore listened to the heels clicking away down the corridor with more than professional interest. When they ceased, he roused himself from his ecstatic stupor and rolled over to his nightstand to inspect his earnings. His set price for a solo performance was 1 silver ducat. The Bauta had left 6 gold zecchini. Fiore stared at the coins as his mind executed rapid calculations. There was his room and board for the next few months, certainly. He'd set aside half against whatever infirmity might befall him. But even so, he'd still have enough to indulge in several small luxuries. More chalk, charcoal, and drawing paper. Proper pencils, perhaps. A new zibaldone bound in leather. He could almost taste the crooked anchor's chocolate even now. His head lightly spun with the windfall, as if he'd already drunk too much of it. He went to his window. A breath of fresh air only increased his giddy thrill. Still, he retained the presence of mind to enact the proper rite. He didn't bother untying the strings of his domino mask. It slipped off over his head with ease. Its paper construction felt light as a fallen leaf in his hand. He gave it a fond brush of his fingertips, almost wishing he could keep it as a memento of what had proved a strange but no less delightful evening. Then he flung out his arm and cast it into the canal to join its brethren in tonight's final sacrifice to Saturn. Io Saturnalia, he murmured with another stolen smile. Enzo had done worse things on impulse. He'd never hired a courtesan before. On the whole, he considered the experience much less sordid than others had led him to believe. Indeed, as he departed the berth, he felt more light-hearted than he had in many months. Not even the sight of Carlotta awaiting him above the hatch could sour his good mood. Not that he blamed Carlotta in the least, she was merely doing her duty as implied by the livery she wore. Black woolen waistcoat, frock coat, and breeches with the embroidered crest in black thread over the waistcoat's left breast, the only hint to her loyalties, and this further hidden by the frock coat's lapel. Nor did she seem to blame him for his indulgence, for the look she cast down on him from the top of the ladder appeared mild, verging on indifferent. This quickly became a look she cast up at him as he ascended, for he towered over her uneven ground, as he towered over most people. She fell into step behind him as he passed her. He set a course, not toward the bar or the whirling dance, but instead carved a path through the crowd to the gangplank leading off the ship altogether, and to the gondola waiting below. His family's gondola fleet were all shellacked a uniform shade of gleaming beetle black, which gave off the merest glinting hint of the entwined serpent carvings running down their lengths. His own particular gondola awaited him tonight, marked out by its gondolier, Ippolito, rather than any peculiarity of its own appearance. Carlotta held the fell's heavy woolen drape open for him to enter, then followed him in. Once they'd both settled on opposite ends of the black leather upholstered interior, he facing the fore of the gondola, she facing the aft, she rapped her knuckles against the black walnut ribs overhead, and Ippolito smoothly slid the craft out to join the current of the canal. Carlotta cast her dispassionate gaze out through the lattice work window. Enzo did the same on the opposing side, though his thoughts turned inward rather than toward the city still cavorting in the throes of Saturnalia's final hours. Carlotta would, of course, ensure that Lucrezia heard all about Enzo's little adventure. Enzo didn't mind. Again, it was only her duty, and besides, he'd done nothing that his eldest sister or any other member of his family might disapprove of. He'd remained masked, given no one his name, and gone on his way as quietly as he arrived. Most importantly, he carried no sword, nor had he started or finished any other sort of fight. In the long, silent, lonesome gondola voyage back to his family's palazzo provided him with ample opportunity for reflection on the night's unexpected delights. Lucretia had permitted him to wander the city throughout Saturnalia with Carlotta's accompaniment. On the first night, Carlotta had stuck to him like his own shadow, following so close in his footsteps that if he spun, he could never see her. By the third night, however, after he'd made it plain through his actions as well as his words that he had no intention of shaking her off his tail, she relaxed her pursuit, finally following a few steps or sometimes even entire yards behind him. He grew accustomed to her presence to the point where, if he passed a certain corner and glanced over his shoulder to find her gone, he halted his own progress and waited for her to catch up to him. He didn't have any particular destination, after all, or any schedule to meet. His only desire was wandering, the simple relief of going out and stretching his legs amidst novel sights and sounds after so many months spent indoors, staring at the same walls and knowing only the company of family and staff. The city in the throes of Saturnalia held enough exuberance by proxy that he didn't feel the need to overindulge himself in drink or dance or danger. Each night he betook himself to a different island and explored corners that he hadn't beheld since childhood, and most not even then. By the final night of Saturnalia, Carlotta trusted him enough that she didn't even follow him on foot, but rather took him at his word that he would keep to the canals, and instead shouted him by standing aboard his gondola alongside Ippolito and trailing through the waters behind him. Yet as Enzo had rounded the infamous dry-docked ship and stared up at the wild throng on deck, he found himself arrested by the particular sight of the most beautiful man he'd ever beheld. Even at a distance, the perfection of the masculine figure had shown plain to Enzo's eyes. The lean frame balanced against the deck railing on lithe arms, the drapery of the pale linen shirt limned in moonlight belying the subtle musculature beneath. The scarlet sash foretold both the fellow's profession and the slender bend of his waist. Beneath the balusters stood a pair of legs as well formed as if they'd been turned on the same lathe, one extended, the other cocked at the knee to throw the whole form into a casual contrapposto pose. Though the courtesan stood almost a full head shorter than most of the crowd surrounding him, he carried himself with the confidence of a man thrice his size, like an alley cat amongst hunting hounds, master of his own domain and bowing to none. Then their eyes had met, and when the courtesan cast down the season's greeting, how could Enzo do otherwise but answer the call? With a sidelong glance at the gondola to make sure Carlotta marked his intent and destination, he strode to the gangplank and began his ascent. Finding the courtesan in the crowd felt like discovering a garnet amidst gravel. Distance, Enzo realized as he drew up to the man, had done his appearance no justice. Standing over him, he could perceive not just the beauty of his body, but the delicate details of his face. The eyes, of course, commanded Enzo's notice first and foremost. They'd called to him from fathoms above, and to look into them struck his very soul. Enormous, as dark as Enzo's own garb, creating deep well springs that nevertheless held a warmth which, with a glance, could spark into a blaze of passion. The face surrounding them proved likewise compelling. Full lips which demanded devouring, a noble nose which came to a sharp point, cheekbones carved from marble, a jawline which begged for fingertips to stroke its well-honed edge to the tapered tip of the chin. Nonetheless, for all these sharply drawn divisions, the effect of the whole remained subtle, small, and delicate, like the thousand miniature cuts in a gemstone crafting ethereal brilliance. Amidst all of this, Enzo almost forgot to greet him. Nevertheless, the courtesan smiled in his reply. Then, in what felt like two shakes of a sail, Enzo found himself taken below decks. The courtesan conducted his trade in a matter-of-fact manner that one might consider perfunctory and indifferent were it not for the ease and charm with which he addressed Enzo. Any lingering hesitations on Enzo's part the courtesan gently laid aside, and even Enzo's own bizarre request did not dissuade him. And oh, how splendidly he'd fulfilled that request. The surrender of the sash alone sufficed to raise Enzo to half-mast. The sidelong glances between each garment, a fluttering lash here, the bite of a lip there, spoke almost as loud as Enzo's own pulse pounding in his ears. I know you want this, and I know how to best give it to you. When all at last gave way, Enzo beheld splendor well worth the wait. The lithe, lean, slender, and supple form, thoroughly bronzed by the sun, seemed the work of a sculptor's chisel rather than nature's hand. The courtesan had spun, giving Enzo a much appreciated glimpse of the perfect peach of his ass, then mounted the bed. The beauty of his body didn't cease there, for his cock had a graceful upward curve, with its pleasing girth tapering toward the tip. The only flaw, and Enzo hesitated to deem it a flaw, for it added significant interest for him, was the scar running from the root up through foreskin like a lightning strike, parallel to the underside vein. Enzo wished he might have traced it with his tongue, mask be damned. Still more enticing than even this, however, was the courtesan's gaze. The fleeting, fluttering, ferocious glances that stopped Enzo's heart every time they met his eyes. And then to see them forced shut as those perfect lips fell open, and the lithe back arched in ecstasy to unleash a magnificent spray of sea foam, which would have done Neptune himself proud. Enzo had spent without a touch, and felt not a drop of shame for it. The mere recollection of this evening's encounter would satisfy him, not just for tonight, but for many nights after. Even so, he had half a mind to return to the Kingfisher the very next moment he could slip away. That's been chapter 1 of Fiorenzo by Sebastian Nothwell. And as you could hear, the language is wonderfully decadent. And I hope that you will seek it out. It is a male, obviously, romance that Sebastian um, called a fantasy of manners, which I kind of loved. So it is historically based and an absolutely delightful book. I mean, truly, the language will draw you in, and it is transporting. You will find yourself believing in this place, and I hope you enjoyed that. This has been Lisette for Book Date, and I hope you come back soon. Thank you.